Race relations in the United States of America is a very fascinating struggle that you see, especially through the 20th century. Now, I want to give you a little bit of perspective so you can understand kind of where all this is coming from and what was going on. First of all, I do want you to understand about basic race relations in the world. In the world, it's actually, unfortunately, very normal for different races to not mix and not get together and not share very much. This has been a source of conflict throughout the history of the earth. And so I do want you to keep that in mind, that America, as we faced this challenge and tried to struggle through it, even though it took us, 200 years of our history to really kind of struggle through this, at least America did struggle through it. And eventually we've gotten to where we are now, where we think all of these things are really kind of silly. In general, most people do. Think that, the fact that you can't get along with people who are white or Hispanic or Asian or African American, that just sounds kind of crazy. We get along with everybody now. You can live next door to anybody. But in the history of the world, that has not been the case. People have been very separated and much conflict has happened. So the United States is a little bit different in the fact that it has really tried to push through and struggled with itself to get to the point it is now. And I say that because there's a lot of people who still really talk about how bad America is in race relationships. And while we're not perfect, we have struggled and kind of been the leader in many of these issues. In the United States, this goes back all the way really to the founding, when they struggled about slavery. There were some states that were slave states and some states that were not. So even back then there was the struggle, during the founding era. Now, the Civil War happened in the 1860s. That was when Lincoln was president, and the slaves were officially freed in the United States. However, just because they were freed in 1860 does not mean by any means that things were perfect. Things continued for a very long time to still be very hard, especially for African Americans. It wasn't really, and we'll get to this, until the 1960s when all these things were put into law, all the discrimination laws were put into place. So from 1860, when slaves were free, for about 100 years, for 100 years there was still this time period where, although they weren't slaves, African Americans could still basically legally be treated like second-rate citizens. It took 100 years to do that. That's kind of a long time. So we're going to see that struggle happen starting now as we kind of start with the beginning of the 20th century. You'll see it all the way happen, and then when we get to the 1960s and the 1950s, we'll really start to see that struggle heat up and the leadership start to take control, where to now it's not normal, or it's not socially acceptable to be discriminatory. Although some people do still discriminate or are prejudiced against other races, it's not very socially acceptable. However, during this time period, it really kind of was socially acceptable. It was okay for people to feel that. And that seems strange. Why was it ever okay for people to feel this prejudice? Now, I don't think it's right. But however, you have to remember that we are going back for thousands and thousands of years of world tradition and trying to turn over thousands of years of world's tradition. So, should it have happened faster? Sure. Should it have been better? Sure. But the fact that we did it at all is pretty impressive, I think, in my book. So keep that in mind as you look through. We're going to study things about Jim Crow laws. In this chapter, we're also going to discuss the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Those were two kind of legal issues that really happened. The Plessy versus Ferguson case happened, during this time period, but the Jim Crow laws happened throughout this time period. So learn about those, understand, but keep this in mind. We are going to study race relations through this entire year.